Radio Retro Future.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bonzard of Radio Retro Future here to discuss another topic related to the steampunk genre and its aesthetics. But before we go on, I have to do a quick little shilling. Currently, we are preparing a Kickstarter that I want to launch on the 1st of March. It's gonna be for our book Bound for the Sticks and its supplementary book, the Archaeology Companion. And we also are gonna offer up miniatures, which is this. Well, this is a very big one because I do love my big miniatures. I must say I really enjoy this skill. But this is the protagonist, Igraine Mortuba, aka Strixie. You're gonna have to read the book to find out what that is about. But yeah, we're also going to offer miniatures, and a matter of fact, you can help us to reach 100 followers on the Kickstarter page. And then if we reach the 100, which we have seven more to go, I will commission another one. I'm already talking to the developer and my concept artist to get a proper thing done. And a matter of fact, you have a choice because we are currently running a poll on this community, this YouTube community's YouTube page. So if you go to the community page, there's a poll 3 posts back, and currently near running ahead. So if you want another female character, that is currently what the community has voted for. So if you want to change that, you better start voting. You have until we reach 100 followers on the Kickstarter page. And with that being said, let's continue. Today's topic is steampunk Victorian science fiction. This was something I want to talk about for a while now, but I recently made a video, a YouTube short called What is Steampunk? And where I use my standard, description rather, that steampunk can mean one of 3 things. One, it's an aesthetic, usually inspired by retrofuturism and pop culture. The second is a community that you might know from the conventions. And 3, it's a genre of stories, like the ones I am writing now. The thing with steampunk, or what makes it such a very interesting genre to write for, is that it doesn't come from the right source. It's not like fantasy where everyone is trying to either reinvent Tolkien or recreate Game of Thrones. That seems to be like the 2 methods of writing fantasy these days. And that's also one of the reasons that I'm lost interest in the genre. I've been a big fantasy fan very early on. As a matter of fact, I am going to join a podcast very soon talking about my favorite comics, which includes Chronicles of the Black Moon, which is very D&D-esque creator. But I think he's actually one of the original D&D writers, as a matter of fact, Freudeval. And I just love the insanity of that comic and how over the top it is. But yeah, that's French comics for you. They have a wonderful. Yeah, I know that that chauvinism is a French word, but their comic book creators have a wonderful sense of humor. I mean, look at Tintin, Asterix and Obelix, Lucky Luke. All of those are French of origin. Those were the comics that I grew up with. And I really want to expand my palette in Western comics in particular, and noir. Of course, I started reading Black Sad. Anyway, what about steampunk being Victorian science fiction? It's a statement that I cannot disagree with more. And, well, a matter of fact, I've got examples of that sitting right behind me. These are bookends. Yes, you can order them on the Kickstarter as well. And if you look at them, look at this gentleman over here, Associate 212. This is a prototype. You can clearly see this is not inspired by Victorian science fiction. And there's the problem. I had a discussion with one gentleman. I think his name was David Davos. I think. Let me see. I've got the conversation on steampunk tendencies right here, where he says, "Well, I prefer Victorian-inspired science fiction as a definition of steampunk." Well, and here is my problem with this statement. And what it is again, I'm gonna pick up Associate 212 for a moment and say, where in Victorian science fiction have you met characters like this? But to say that steampunk is Victorian-inspired science fiction is just wrong. And one of the reasons is that Victorian science fiction... First of all, how many Victorian writers do you know? Let's start there. Because, quite frankly, I know some stories written in the Victorian era of science fiction. I do not know their authors. And if you say H.G. Wells, well, he only wrote, during the Victorian period, he only wrote one story. I just checked. And Jules Verne is even a little later. So, this idea, and also Jules Verne wasn't English. So there's this thing that first we have to discover, like, what do you mean with Victorian? Because I don't think that Victorian means to these people what I believe it means, which is the reign of Queen Victoria, which is about 1892, I think, somewhere around that period. So late 19th century. But also that the Victorian science fiction was future prediction. What I mean with that is this is, what the Victorians believe the future would be like. So when somebody says, another friend of mine uses often, well, steampunk is how the Victorians imagined the future to be, that's a lot more closer to the truth. In which case, Victorian futurism would be a more apt definition. However, that's not the case. So, but let's first make the distinction that Victorian science fiction is future prediction as seen from the perspective of a 19th century individual, a romantic futurist, as they were called back in the day. And steampunk is not futurism. It's retrofuturism. Now, retrofuturism, you can look at retrofuturism as two ways. You can look at it as, well, it's how people in the past perceive the future. However, you can also look at it from our perspective, which is, it's an archaic form of futurism. And, of course, you also have a more typical sci-fi definition of it, which is an aesthetic aspired by history, which in case, well, look at Warhammer 40k. A lot of people who started with steampunk drew their inspiration mostly for Warhammer 40k for that reason. And again, that's one of the reasons why I say the definition that steampunk is Victorian science fiction is just not correct, because most people who got into steampunk never studied Victorian science fiction. They love retrofuturism. They love the science fiction aesthetic where you have, well, let's say in Dune, where you have future people have sword fights in space. They love the idea of space pirates and all those archaic references in futuristic settings. You've got, all these knight themes in Warhammer. You've got, like, the Inquisitors in Warhammer. Warhammer is filled with all these historical references. BattleTech, with its nobility and, references to the First World War, also has that. So, I often say that steampunk isn't new for that reason. I mean, retrofuturism and the retrofuturistic aesthetic is part and parcel of science fiction, period, of all ages. And especially in anime, look at the Gundam series where you have, like, all these nobles dressed as Napoleonic nobility. So, what is steampunk then? I started this channel to, discuss what is steampunk if it isn't if it isn't Victorian science fiction. What makes steampunk unique from everything else? And for me, I use the definition by Sterling, so that's not even one of my own definitions before people make that assumption. Cyberpunk in the past, and I just fell in love with that description of the genre. And he's of course a writer, so he's looking at it purely from a genre perspective, in which a bunch of writers wrote, and a genre is a collection of stories. Let's not forget that. So that's why I despise all these writers. Like, oh, my story is so different from everything else; it deserves to be its own genre. No, that's not how genres work. I mean, my universe is very much unlike what I've ever seen. I often ask people, what is the inspiration for your series, Bonser? And I can name like it's a list of things, which includes noir, pulp. The SCP Foundation has been a mild inspiration. It's not that I read the SCP. I admire the work ethic, the community that the SCP Foundation has built. That is what inspires me. As for the execution of the format, I've chosen to do it in my own way because, although when it comes to the SCP Foundation, like me, I care about the concepts and I think it can be done better. But it's thousands of stories, and the SCP Foundation, of course, has a lot of writers of every level. They've got like massively experienced writers who've taken the format in their own direction, and then you have like the beginning writers who follow the basic format by a T, not really understanding what they're doing. So there's clearly, it's interesting to see that level and difference. And for me, I've definitely chosen my own path and refined it, and how I imagine this thing. And that's why I'm so proud of this, because yes, these are old stories, but they're all completely rewritten to fit my current vision for the series, where it's more, instead of a file, it's more a letter with attachments from files. So it's a bit of a difference there in approach. So this is it's a series that I constantly refine. And there's also this argument he makes at some point where I forgot to properly unfold the text here, but he makes a suggestion that genres can change. And well, this is completely untrue, and again, why I believe this is the Victorian definition is a terrible one, that science fiction and genres don't change. I mean, look at the aesthetics of Star Trek. Sure, Star Trek as a concept may have changed little. You've got a crew on a ship, and they come across all these problems that they then have to resolve. But the aesthetics have changed fundamentally, and again, it's like their perception of the future from the 1970s to the perception of the future of the early 2000s style. And after that, you've got, what was the last one that was probably decent? Not Discovery, the one before that. I forgot which Star Trek series that was. But, they still were kind of true, but they also fell in the trap of making it more serialized, as modern TV sensibilities demand, or rather modern TV companies demand, because they want people to binge rather than, watch week to week as shows were used to be made. So there's that issue. But to get back to the point, when it comes to the definition of steampunk and why I separate it in three different objects, is that when I have these discussions, first of all, the people I discuss this topic with often do not respond to my arguments. They never tell me specifically where I'm wrong. When I'm having these arguments, when I say, well, this is my vision, these are my arguments, I often end with a question so they can respond straight to that question. Like I ask here, how do you explain steampunk Iron Man? He does not answer that question. And the reason for that is when people define all these punk genres, and that's why I despise them so much, is that people look at one arbitrary element. It's like taking, again, I'm using the associate here, take this one character and say this is Google Punk. You see, because he wears goggles, so this is goggle punk. I mean, why is it not, padded helmet, tank helmet punk, or beak punk, or leather coat punk, or leather punk, and there's a cat playing with a bunch of. There you go. Off you go. So there is that going on, and Sprocket, come over here. Come and see the people. Yes, that's the thing. That tunnel vision, because they just focus on one thing and not the theme. So for me, when it comes to the steampunk genre, I believe it's a very thematic thing. That's why steampunk as a genre is so hard to explain, because a most important inspiration for steampunk is Western, because Western has that often the topics of change and progress embedded into it, where you have, the rugged pioneers who come from the old world, they want to start a new thing, and they're doing their own thing, very independent, very individual, very community based. And then you've got, civilization, moving upward to the west. You've got the carpetbaggers, the non-local politicians running for politics, so they can basically enforce the will of the federal government or big business, and of course, things like the telegraph comes in, yada yada yada. You see this in Deadwood, very powerful. I love that series. Go watch it, especially if you want to get a feel for how you could write 19th century dialogue. And I also love how you can see their speech change as more women move into the town, because all these men might be uncouth prospectors, but when a woman enters the room, they all of a sudden have a tendency to behave a lot more. The prostitutes notwithstanding, of course, or whatever the political correct term is for sex workers these days. Now, and for me, the topics such as progress, the old world versus the new worlds. This is why, this is how, for me, steampunk can transfer into fantasy, where you have, the old world magic versus the technological new world, which is, Arcanum is an excellent example of this. Lost Exile, it's more of retro-futuristic science fiction, but it also has that theme of, this is the old way of doing things, now we're gonna do things a new way, and the old order is being replaced by a new, more dynamic one that is far more adaptable. So it has that constant struggle in the background. I mean, steampunk is very much about the setting, and the characters just happen to be in that situation. In particular, the character of Ygritte Mortimer, Bound for the Styx, is a girl who wants to get out, wants to break free from the restrictions of her homeworld, but she also looks for a place to belong, and so there's this constant struggle of, that internal struggle in that's reacting to the world around her, and that's why steampunk characters are again so hard to write. I mean, you've got the typical characters from science fiction. The mad scientist, the over-ambitious scientist, the ambitious space explorer, or whatever type, the mercenary. I mean, there's a lot of influences of noir as well. And I will make a video. I actually started on the blog on what is for me the ultimate steampunk character. And for that, again, I look to Western and noir for inspiration. And what I mean with an ultimate steampunk character, I mean a character that could only emerge from a steampunk situation, where there is this struggle between old and new. And I guess that in a way, the protagonist of my first book, The Wrench in the Machine, Aldborough, is kind of a prototype of that. Where he is a man that is very set in his ways. A bit of a homebody, bit of a, he doesn't like, where the world is going, and he constantly struggles with that. But he also has to adapt, and he adapts, but it's all, very slowly. He feels, well, kind of forced to participate, which again also comes back into, some of the themes in Cyberpunk as well, where if you want to partake in all the benefits that society has to offer, you're going to have cybernetic implants. And I'm afraid that's where our current world is also going, where I expect at some point it's maybe not by law, but you are made to have like things like implants in order to do your payment processing for something like that. I expect that is going to happen. I mean, and it's not that it's necessarily done by law, but by society. And I mean, for another example, let's say the use of the internet is a very good example of this. I mean, I've worked for various municipal governments, and there's always that moment where there is like a person in her 70s coming by your desk, and she says, oh, I want to like fill in a form, and you're like, well, we don't do that anymore, you have to do it digitally. You're sitting there, you want to help this person, but the rules say no. And there's no law saying that the person has to do that, but the system itself that is grown organically demands basically all people to adapt. And for me, those are very important themes for the genre. Now, aesthetically, I said I would promote him, and this is not the first time I recorded this, by the way, so anyway, this is something that the gentleman created. And, well, he also described that this is not typical, that fits in the steampunk box. Well, let's talk about, my distinction between genre and aesthetic. Because when I see this, right, I lose from all the intent and the discussion that we're having right now, I'd say this is a prop from like a 1940s science fiction film. Something that could be done by Disney or Warner Brothers. They all had this aesthetic. So I would say, well, it's 1940s science fiction. It's retro science fiction or romantic futurist. However, when it comes to the genre, I'd say, well, yes, this is something that completely fits in. Because, this is something that you expect to encounter in a steampunk setting. And it's because steampunk has all this plethora of pop culture influence, like steampunk Iron Man, and in this case 1940s science fiction films, and I mean, definitely goes for this, where you can find a plethora of influences that are not that extremely hard to guess. And also when it comes to the community end, this is the type of stuff that steampunks like. So also from the community thing, it becomes, a personal preference thing. What do they like at the moment? And again, especially when it comes to the topic of steampunk Iron Man, steampunks like pop culture. When it comes to historical awareness, however, they don't know that much about history. I've tested this several times, this thesis years ago, when I asked, do you know who Bismarck is? And this was before Sabaton made their hit single Bismarck. And maybe some of them would know that the Bismarck was a battleship, because it's almost a myth that adventure of the Bismarck and the sinking of the Bismarck is like a mythical story from that era. The sinking of the Hood. Anyone with a bit of interest in the Second World War knows of the Bismarck. However, they don't know that Bismarck was the Iron Chancellor of Germany during the Victorian era, the man who is responsible for uniting the German regions into a single empire. And that's, it's not a small event in history. Without that event, we would not have Well, not in the shape that we had it, like the First and Second World War. I mean, the First World War is an extension, um, a result of the Franco-Prussian War that Bismarck uh, provoked, and that's kind of like my thing. The steampunks know, and I'm talking mostly about the costume community now. They know pop culture's greatest hits because it's pop culture, because that's what they've seen in the Hollywood films and on the History Channel and that kind of stuff. Um, I mean, when it comes to the writers, yeah, that's a completely different story. These are people often with a great passion for the pulps, the shadow, all the of literature's greatest hits. Robert E. Howard, Lovecraft, who often makes an appearance in fiction, in steampunk themes and aesthetics and yada yada yada. So this is a very elaborated way. Many arguments why I do not agree with the statement that steampunk is somehow a continuation of Victorian science fiction. I don't think many people know any science fiction from that era. I personally, I still have to read The Brass Man on the Prairie. I'm not even sure from what year that is, but it's a prolific one, and it's I mean, the aesthetic clearly has its influences from Victorian science fiction. However, the aesthetic has its influence from many places, including things like Blade Runner and Marvel and DC and Star Trek and Star Wars and yada yada yada. Look up any science fiction topic with steampunk in front of it. You're likely to get hits on Google Images. That's a very long-winded video. It's a complicated topic, and I love talking about it. So please go follow our Kickstarter. It would mean the world to me if we can make that reach 100, and preferably as quickly as possible, so I have all the time to get the figurine done in time. My designer has been warned, so he knows that's coming, and of course you can leave your preferred pick in the poll. And I also said that if I would reach 150 followers, I'm gonna seriously try to find a role-playing game developer, because people keep asking me about it. Is there going to be a role-playing system for the Association of Ishtar? Well, the answer is yes. I would love to do that, or at least a game. I was thinking myself to start off with a card game or something, something to generate art. And that's also why we are working on a comic book, so we can use art from the comic books in that as well. So it's probably going to be arcology themed, where our next books are taking place. So looking forward to all those future projects, but I'm gonna need your help. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm gonna bid you adieu, and as always, make things your way. Good night.